Okay. In order to really understand what our Gemara is talking about, we need to review a little bit, go back a little bit to the bottom of DAF Nun Vav Amud Beis. With the Mishnah had presented us with a machlokes regarding the halacha of when a man and a woman have kiddushin in a case where the marriage is a puzzle marriage. We know that if a man actually marries a woman who is puzzle to him, let's say a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, or a Kohen marries a grusha, a divorcee, so then the halacha is that not only is this a forbidden marriage, but the woman is permanently tainted, in that if she's a bas Kohen, for example, she cannot go back to her father's house after that marriage and eat truma. If she's a Bas Yisrael, she's permanently stigmatized and can never marry a Kohen. Those are the ramifications. So the question that the Mishnah undertakes is, what happens if a man who's puzzle to this woman, in a puzzle marriage, what if there's not actual physical consummation of Nisuin, but rather there's only Kiddushin? So this is a machlokas between Rabbi Meir on the one side and Rav Shimon and Rabbi Elazar on the other side. Rabbi Meir says is that since the Kiddushin is for the purposes ostensibly of consummation, so therefore even now she becomes a puzzle, and therefore during the course of the Kiddushin, whilst there's still Kiddushin between the two of them, if let's say she's a Bas Kohen, she cannot go and eat Truma in her father's house. Reb Shimon and Rabbi Elazar disagree, and they say that, look, since Lamaisa, she has not consummated the marriage physically, she's not a chalola right now, and therefore, if she's a Bas Kohen, for example, she'd be allowed to go to her father's house and eat Truma. That is the discussion that's undertaken by the Mishnah. Fine. Now, we go to 6 lines from the bottom of Daf Nun Vav Amud Beis. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Oshia. And Rabbi Oshia now says a similar halacha, which is as follows: Pitzua daka kohen shekidesh bas Yisrael. And here's the issue: you have a man who's called a pitzua daka. The Torah says lo yavo pitzua daka bikal Hashem, that a person who has crushed testes, he's rendered sterile, is not allowed to marry a Jewish girl, a regular Jewish girl called Kahal Hashem. And what happens if that person who's a pitzua daka is also a kohen, and he marries a Jewish girl? So the question is, and he only presents kiddushin to her. So now the question is as follows, the way many of the Meforshim learn. There's a halacha that normally when a woman just receives kiddushin, she's not entitled to consume the estate of her husband until they actually have nisuin and they're living as husband and wife. But that's only under normal circumstances. Let's say, the Gemara in Ksubis gives an example of, let's say, a year goes by after giving her kiddushin, and you haven't yet done, the groom gets cold feet, and he hasn't yet consummated the marriage with his wife after a year. So the halacha is that she's allowed to eat from his estate, and if he's a kohen, she's allowed to eat truma. So the question is, this is seemingly the same situation of the machlokas between Reb Meir on the one side and Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon on the other side. According to Reb Meir, since this is a forbidden marriage because he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl, even though he's a kohen and he's allowed to eat truma, but this girl is not allowed to eat truma because she's rendered in advance. She's a lady in waiting. She's in advance a chalala, and therefore she's not allowed to eat truma. So, l'Reb Meir de'amar mishtameres l'bia psula de'oraisa lo achla hanami lo achla. According to Reb Meir, who says that any woman who's in waiting to have a forbidden intimate relationship with a man is not allowed to eat truma. So in this case too, she would not be allowed to eat truma. But l'Rebbe Elazar v'Reb Shimon de'amri mishtameres l'bia psula de'oraisa achla hanami achla. But according to Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon, who say that no, just because she's in waiting to consummate a prohibited relationship doesn't mean that now she's a chalala. And so here too now this woman is not a chalala, and therefore if a year goes by and he doesn't present her with nisuin, so then she's allowed to demand to eat from his estate, including his truma. So the Gemara says, mimai. Maybe your analogy is not an apt analogy. Dilma adkan lo kami Rabbi Elazar v'Reb Shimon hasam, ella diyesh lo lahachil b'makom acher, aval hacha de'en lo lahachil b'makom acher lo. The Gemara says maybe the analogy is not a good analogy. In the case of the Mishnah, we were talking about a Kohen Gadol, let's say, marrying an Almana. In that scenario, we had said that according to Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar, this woman is not tainted by the Kiddushin that this man presents to her, because they haven't physically consummated yet. Maybe the only time that Reb Elazar and Reb Shimon are going to be makel like that is only in a situation where the person that's presenting the Kiddushin has other options of marrying other women within Klal Yisrael. A Kohen Gadol can marry any woman he wants except for an Almana, right? So maybe that's the reason why he doesn't stigmatize her by presenting her with Kiddushin. But let's say a guy who's a Pitzua Daka, he's usher to all Jewish women. And therefore maybe his Kiddushin is more stigmatizing than a Kohen Gadol's Kiddushin to an Almana. And therefore even Reb Elazar and Reb Shimon would agree that in that situation she's not allowed to eat Truma. Maybe you'll tell me that a Pitzua Daka is not usher to all Jewish women, because maybe a Pitzua Daka is allowed to marry the daughter of converts, and we're going to learn about that whole discussion momentarily, that the daughter of a convert, according to one opinion, may not be prohibited to a Pitzua Daka, because the Torah says that a Pitzua Daka can't come into Kahal Hashem. So is a convert called Kahal Hashem or not? That's what the Gemara is going to deliberate over shortly. And perhaps, therefore, on the side that she is allowed to marry a Pitzua Daka, therefore, if he was a Kohen and a Pitzua Daka and he was to marry her, she would be permitted to him. He wouldn't passel her. And he would be allowed to give her Truma. So therefore, it is a good analogy. So the Gemara says, V'hami baya boila, Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Yoshia, v'lo pashitle. But you can't say that because the Gemara had actually asked this as a question. The Gemara doesn't have an answer to that question. Don't tell me that a Pitzua Daka is exactly analogous to the Kohen Gadol to an Almana in our Gemara, just because a Pitzua Daka has other options of women that he's permissibly allowed to marry, because we don't know that for a fact. And therefore your analogy is jumping the gun. It's not an apt analogy. So Itmar Abaya Omar Holu Ma'achila Below Yada'a. Abaya, however, says that it is a good analogy. You know why it's a good analogy? Because I'll give you an example of where a Pitzua Daka is allowed to legally feed his wife Truma. And therefore, just like a Pitzua Daka is allowed to legally feed his wife Truma, so too you have the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol. It's the same thing. Even though he's not allowed to legally feed this wife Truma because it's an illicit marriage, but there are other marriages which are perfectly legal, and I can do the same thing by a Pitzua Daka. What's the example? Where a man did not, the way Rashi explains the case of below Yada'a is as follows. Below Yada'a is a euphemism, I'd say, by when they had not been physically intimate. The case is as follows. A man is happily married, a Kohen is happily married to his wife, he's perfectly healthy, goes through an accident, chas v'shalom, and he becomes a Pitzua Daka. And his wife has already been eating Truma for years. When he becomes a Pitzua Daka, only after he has relations with his wife after his accident does he render her into a halala, not allowing her to eat Truma. But let's say she hasn't yet been intimate with her husband after his accident. Is she still allowed to continue eating Truma that she had started previously? The answer is yes. So therefore, the Gemara says, here's an example of where a Pitzua Daka is married to a woman and he's allowed to give her Truma. So you see, I found a case where you see that a Pitzua Daka is not completely precluded from allowing women to eat the Truma from his house, and that therefore it's the same thing by the Almana to the Kohen Gadol. It's perfectly analogous to our Mishnah. Rabbi says, I will also give you a defense of this analogy, because yes, again, a Pitzua Daka is allowed to feed other people Truma, that he has the ability to feed his servants Truma. And even though that's not within the context of marriage, but if you're looking for something that's analogous between the Pitzua Daka and an Almana to a Kohen Gadol, even though a Pitzua Daka is not allowed to marry any women within the Kahal Hashem, but nevertheless he's still allowed to find a way to feed Truma to people that are within his purview. So too, a Kohen Gadol can feed other people within his purview, and therefore the case is analogous. So Abaya lo Omar Kirava, Kinyan de Ishus, Mekinyan de Ishus Yalfinan, Velo Yalfinan, Kinyan de Ishus, Mekinyan de Avodim. So the Gemara now just goes through explaining why Abaya disagrees with Rava, and Rava disagrees with Abaya. Abaya says, you Rava are trying to analogize a Pitzua Daka Kohen to a Kohen Gadol to an Almana, and you're trying to say, well, just like the Kohen Gadol has other women that he can feed Truma to other than this Almana, the Pitzua Daka can feed Truma to other people than his wife. It's not an analogy, because we're trying to find cases within the context of marriage where these two men are allowed to feed their wives Truma. You're not giving me a case, Rava, where a Pitzua Daka can feed his wife Truma. You're giving me a case where a Pitzua Daka can feed his servant Truma. That's not a good analogy. If you want to really analogize the two and say that they're comparable, you have to find a case where the Kohen Gadol can feed other women Truma, and a Pitzua Daka can feed other wives Truma, not just his servants. And V'Rava lo Amar ke Abaya, Shani Hasam Shekvar Achla. And Rava says to Abaya, I disagree with your analogy. Remember, what was Abaya's analogy? He said that in a situation where they were previously married before the guy became a Pitzua Daka, his wife is allowed to continue eating Truma provided that she doesn't consummate physically after his accident. So Rava says that's not a good analogy of a Pitzua Daka being able to feed Truma to his wife. He says, because in that case, why? Shekvar Achla. The only reason why she's allowed to continue eating Truma is because of the previous permissible relationship which they had. But if we're talking about a situation where we want to find a case where after he commits the sinful relationship, the woman is still allowed to continue eating Truma, you don't find that by a Pitzua Daka, where you do find that by a Kohen Gadol, that even after he's committed the forbidden act, he can feed another wife Truma. So therefore the Gemara says it's not analogous. Ve'abaya shekvar achla lo amrinon de'ilote mahachi bas Yisrael shenises lakonamis techol shekvar achla. Abaya's response to that argument launches into this Abaya's defense. Abaya says, you know something, the reason why this Pitzua Daka's wife is eating Truma is not because of her previous relationship to the husband when he was healthy. And I'll prove it to you. Just because you were married previously to the guy when he was healthy is not what gives you the right to eat Truma now. You know how I know this? Because let's say a Bas Yisrael is married to a Kohen, and the Kohen dies. Is she allowed to continue eating Truma by virtue of the fact that she had a previous marriage to him? No. Once her husband dies, assuming she has no children from him, she has to go back and she's not allowed to eat to her own home, and she cannot eat the husband's Truma anymore. So you see that a previous relationship that was permissible is not what gives her the right now to eat Truma. And you have to say, therefore, that that's the same case by a Pitzua Daka. The reason why she's allowed to eat Truma now, even though the husband is a Pitzua Daka now, is because since they were married beheter, she's allowed to eat Truma now because of her relationship now with the Pitzua Daka.
But the guy that died doesn't have any more Truma to give her anyway.
Oh, so the Gemara says, well, he might have in his estate. So the Gemara says, but you're very close, Bob. V'Rava hasam paka kinyani hachalo paka kinyani. Rava's response to that is, that's not a good analogy. Your case of the husband who's deceased to the case of the Pitzua Daka. There, she's not married anymore to him. She's not married anymore to him because he's deceased. That's why she can't eat Truma. But over here, the reason why she's allowed to continue eating Truma is based on her previous relationship to him, which still continues. But it's only from the koach, it's only from the power of the previous relationship before he was a Pitzua Daka, which allows her to continue eating Truma. And that continues into the present. But in a situation where a person was always a Pitzua Daka from the time that he married this woman, you're never going to find a scenario where he's going to be able to feed a woman Truma. And therefore, it is not analogous to the case of the Almana to the Kohen Gadol in our Mishnah. And therefore, argues Rava, if you want to be able to defend the analogy, you're going to have to come up with a different argument. So basically what the Gemara has just done is a very interesting exercise in explaining that both Abaya and Rava defend the analogy between a Pitzua Daka Kohen who marries a Bas Yisrael to the case of our Mishnah, but Abaya finds one analogy, Rava finds another analogy, and the Gemara explains why Abaya rejects Rava's analogy and Rava rejects Abaya's analogy. Okay, Gufa. Let's go back to the case of a Pitzua Daka who's a Kohen who marries a Bas Gerim, who marries the daughter of converts.
Now remember, we had said that there's a whole question as to whether that's a legal marriage or not, because we're not sure whether a bas gerim is considered to be kahal Hashem. Ba'amine Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Oshia. Petzua daka kohen shenasa bas gerim mahu shiach ilena betruma. Is she allowed to eat the guy's truma? He presents her with, he marries her, they're fully married. Is she allowed to eat truma or not? So ishtik velo amarle velo midi. So Rav Oshia was completely silent. Didn't answer him. So you could have looked at the situation and saying that, look, Rav Oshia was in some kind of situation where he wasn't able to speak or wasn't prepared to talk to anybody. Okay, but fine. But then the problem is Lasof Asar Gava Rabba Achrina Uba Mine Milsa Achrisa Upashat Le Umona Reish Lakish. But a few minutes later, after Rabbi Yochanan had left, Reish Lakish, who was also a great man, walked in. He asked a different shaila, and Rav Oshia just quickly was as talkative as normal and answered his shaila. So another Talmud who's watching this whole situation, who's Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, Amarle Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya Rabbi Oshia Atu Rabbi Yochanan Lav Gava Rabbahu. Why did you answer Reish Lakish's question and not Rabbi Yochanan? Isn't Rabbi Yochanan just as worthy? He's just as great. He's just as worthy of your attention as Reish Lakish. Indeed, we know that Rabbi Yochanan was the Rebbe, so to speak, of Reish Lakish. So, why did you only answer Reish Lakish's shaila and not Rabbi Yochanan's? So, Amar Lei, the Kabomi Noi Milsa the Lesla Pisari. The answer is because Rav Oshia admitted, he says, because he asked me a question that I really don't have a straight answer for, and that's why I was silent. Mm-hmm. In other words, he's not evading the truth. He says, listen, he asked me a question which is problematic, and I don't have a good answer, and that's why I didn't say anything. Now, this is the way Rashi learns. Rashi offers another explanation to this whole Gemara, but we're not going to. We'll stick with that.
When we say Basker, are we talking about one generation or more than?
You'll see it. You'll see in just a second. Well, it seems that she's the daughter of converts. What happens to the next generation after that is unclear from the Gemara, but at least we know that she herself is not a convert. Her parents, or at least one parent, is a convert. The Gemara will clarify this. So the Gemara now says Laman. So now the Gemara says, can you explain to us, the Gemara now reflecting upon Rav Oshia's doubt, why was Rav Oshia in doubt? The Gemara is going to speak this out. Ila Reb Yehuda, ben bikdusha sekoi, ben lav bikdusha sekoi, lo achla. So the Gemara says, we have this machlokas between Reb Yehuda and Reb Yossi, and we're going to speak out this machlokas, but first let's explain it. He shouldn't have had a shaila according to Reb Yehuda, and he shouldn't have had a shaila according to Reb Yossi. Because according to Reb Yehuda, whether a Kohen who's also a Petzua Daka retains the Kedusha of a Kohen vis-a-vis the laws of marriage, either way, she shouldn't have. It should be simple according to Reb Yehuda that if he's married to a Bas Gerim, she should not allow to eat Truma. Now let's explain this. There's a discussion in another Gemara as to whether a Kohen, we're going to see this later on DAF Ayin Vav, a Kohen who's a Petzua Daka, does he lose his Kedusha of a Kohen vis-a-vis the restrictions of marriage? We know that he's not allowed to marry the Kahal Hashem, but the question is he still a Kohen as far as his restrictions of marrying a Grusha, or do we say that once he's become a Petzua Daka, he enters into a new realm of the laws of marriage, so that were he to marry a Grusha, he would not be in violation of his kahuna, he'd only be in violation of being a Petzua Daka. So that's the question the Gemara will undertake later on. Reb Yehuda says, the Gemara says, according to Reb Yehuda, it's irrelevant. She still should not be allowed to eat Truma, because he says, if he does still have the status of a Kohen vis-a-vis marriage, then for sure she should not be allowed to eat Truma, because Reb Yehuda is also of the opinion that anyone who's the daughter of a male convert is considered to be unfit to eat Truma. That just like the daughter of a Halal is not allowed to eat Truma, so too the daughter of a Ger is not allowed to eat Truma either. So therefore, this girl should not be allowed to eat Truma by virtue of the fact that this guy has the status of a Kohen, and therefore he's engaging in a forbidden relationship by virtue of the fact of his kahuna. And so she's puzzled to him. She's puzzled to the kahuna, and by virtue of being puzzled to the kahuna, she's not allowed to eat Truma. So forget about the fact that maybe is Kal Hashem, maybe she's not Kal Hashem. By virtue of the fact that she's not allowed to marry a Kohen, would be reason enough why she cannot eat truma. And ilav bikdusha sekoi lo achla dehamrinon kahal gera mikri kahal. And if you're going to tell me that this Kohen is allowed to, there's no longer a restriction from his kahuna to marry a bas gerim because he doesn't retain the kedusha of a Kohen vis-a-vis marriage anymore now that he's a B'tzua Daka. But you have another problem because Reb Yehuda was also quoted as stating that she's called Kahal Hashem. A bas gerim is Kahal Hashem. So even if he's not considered a Kohen anymore, but the fact that he's marrying this woman as a B'tzua Daka renders her a Chalala because it's a forbidden marriage. And that's another reason why she won't be allowed to eat truma. So no matter how you look at it, either because she's forbidden to a Kohen, or because she's forbidden to a B'tzua Daka, it's a forbidden marriage. And if it's a forbidden marriage, she's rendered a Chalala, and that would be enough of a reason either way to render her unable to eat truma. And that's according to Reb Yehuda. V'ila Reb Yossi, bein b'kedusha sekoi, bein lav b'kedusha sekoi, achla. That according to Reb Yossi, who goes to the other extreme and disagrees with Reb Yehuda on two issues, she will always be allowed to eat truma, regardless of whether you look at this Kohen B'tzua Daka as still retaining his kedushas Kohen or not. How do we look at it? He says, "B'kedusha sekoi achla daha amar af ger shenasagiras bito kishera lekahuna." He says because if you still look at this guy as a Kohen, then he's allowed to marry a bas gerim, because Reb Yossi has the shita that even if she's the daughter of both a ger and a giores, she's still kosher to the kahuna. And if that's the case, then she's allowed to eat truma because this is a perfectly legitimate marriage. So from the standpoint of the kahuna, there's no problem. And ilav bikdusha sekoi achla deha'amar kahal gerim lo ikri kahal. And what about the issue of him being a B'tzua Daka? No problem, because according to Reb Yossi, a daughter of Gerim is allowed to marry a B'tzua Daka because she's not called Kahal Hashem. So you see, you have two extremes. Reb Yehuda is machmir on both. He says, A, she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. B, she's not allowed to marry a B'tzua Daka, and therefore, no matter how you look at it, she's not allowed to eat this truma. According to Reb Yossi, he's liberal in both respects. A, she's allowed to marry a Kohen. B, she's allowed to marry a B'tzua Daka, so she should be allowed to eat truma no matter how you look at this situation. So therefore, I don't understand, why did Reb Oshia just have this doubt? Let him paskin like either Reb Yehuda or like Reb Yossi, and just give him the straight answer. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because there's a third Tana, who's sort of in the middle, in between Reb Yehuda and Reb Yossi, and that's what was bothering Reb Oshia. Ela ali b'dahai Tana, d'tnan Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Isha bas gerim lo sinose lekahuna ad shetehe ima mi Yisrael. That Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is of the opinion that if this woman, this girl, is the daughter of a male convert and a woman who's a Yisrael, only then is she allowed to marry into the kahuna. And the question, therefore, that he had was like this: V'hacha kami boile. In other words, if her father's a convert and her mother's a Yisrael, then she's allowed to marry a Kohen. It's only if her mother's a convert that she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. So, therefore, the question is like this: Kashrus mitos v'ba v'achla, o dilma kedusha mitos v'ba v'lo achla. So the question is like this: in that scenario, where her father is a ger and her mother is a Yisrael, the very fact that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov sort of equivocates on her status, because he says, if her mother's a giores, then she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. If her father's a ger and her mother's a Yisrael, then she is allowed to marry a Kohen. So the question is like this: in that scenario, where the mother's Yisrael, the father's a ger, do we say that the kashrus was added to her, meaning that this is what permits her to marry a Kohen because her mother's a Yisrael, but she's still not called Kahal Hashem, and therefore she's allowed to marry a B'tzua Daka as well? And on that side of the coin, even though she's allowed to marry a Kohen because her mother's a Yisrael, but she's still not called Kahal Hashem because her father's a convert, and therefore it's a legal marriage because the kahuna is no problem and the B'tzua Daka is no problem, right? In which case she'd be allowed to eat truma. That's one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin, is Odilma kedusha mitosva velo achlo, or maybe by virtue of the fact that her mother's a Yisrael, not only is she permitted to the kahuna, but she's also now called Kahal Hashem. And if she's also called Kahal Hashem, so then she wouldn't be allowed to marry a Pitzua Daka, and if she does marry a Pitzua Daka, then she's now a Chalala, and she can't eat Truma. That's why Rav Oshia had this conundrum. He didn't know, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who he thinks that we should paskin like, he didn't know what her status is regarding her being Kahal Hashem or not.
Why does it even have a meaning? Because all the time today we'll say someone, oh, your mother's Jewish. Oh, so you're Jewish. I'm Jewish. I didn't, like, we always...
Judaism is not, it's apples and oranges. One's Jewish status is nothing to do with one's permissibility to the kahuna. There are plenty of Jewish women who are not allowed to marry a Kohen. Right? A Gerusha is fully Jewish, but she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. This is our question. So Tashma. So come and listen. We're going to try and answer the question that Rabbi Oshia was a little bit unclear on. Ki asa Rabbi Acha bar Chinana miJeroma asa va'isi masnisa biyade. That we find this brisa that is brought from the south by this sage Rabbi Acha, and it teaches as follows: Minayin lepitzua daka kohen shenasa baskerim shema achila bitruma. How do you know that if a pitzua daka is a kohen and he's married to the daughter of converts that he feeds her truma? Shenamar v'kohen ki yikna nefesh kinyan kasbo v'goymer yochal bo. That any time a kohen acquires someone with money, then that person is allowed to eat truma, which the brisa extends to a woman that you present kesef kiddushin to. So lamat. So now the Gemara asks, who does this brisa go according to? Ilema l'Rebbe Yehuda ha'amar bein bikdusha seikoi bein lav bikdusha seikoi lo achla. This brisa can't go according to Rebbe Yehuda, because we've established that according to Rebbe Yehuda, regardless of whether you look at the Kohen P'tzua Daka as still being a kedusha of Kohen, regardless, his wife is not allowed to eat truma. We've already established that, even if she's a bas gerim. And ve'ila Rebbe Yossi lama likra ha'amar bein bikdusha seikoi bein lav bikdusha seikoi achla. And according to Rebbe Yossi, who says that she is allowed to eat truma, you shouldn't need a pasuk according to Rabbi Yossi, because he's already established that whether you look at him as a kohen or not, even if you look at him as a kohen, she's permitted to him, and if you don't look at him as a kohen, she's also permitted because she's not called Kahal Hashem. So Rabbi Yossi has already established that. Why do you need a brisa to present the pasuk for that? So Elalav l'Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov u'shma mina kashu shitos v'va'ach l'shma mina. So rather, this brisa must go according to Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov, who is somewhat equivocal as far as this girl's status when her mother's a Yisrael and her father's a ger. It's not clear, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, whether or not she's called Kahal Hashem or not. Yet you see from this brisa that yes, she's permitted to a Kohen, but she's not called Kahal Hashem in the sense that a Pitzua Daka is still allowed to marry her, and that's why you need the pasuk to reveal that to us, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and therefore we conclude from here that this woman would be allowed to eat truma. Let's go on to the next topic. Itmar. Rav Omar, Yesh chuppah la pesulos, u'Shmuel Amar ein chuppah la pesulos. So here's you have an interesting machlokus, which would at face glance, at prima facie, would seem to line up perfectly with our Mishnah. Remember, our Mishnah was talking about a case where a man presents a woman that he's not allowed to marry. He presents her with kiddushin. Is she now puzzle for truma and to the kahuna or not? Reb Meir says she's puzzle for the kahuna and for truma because she's a lady in waiting in anticipation of bia to make her a chalala. Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar say she's not because, listen, she hasn't consummated yet, so therefore she's not a chalala, so therefore she's still allowed to eat truma.
It has to be the 1 year. I was puzzled. It has to be, you kept talking about 1 year.
No. That's in a situation where she's a bas Yisrael. Let's say she's a bas Kohen, okay? Her husband presents her with kiddushin. She's still allowed to go back to her father's house and eat truma, right? The question is, according to Reb Meir, if the man that presented her with kiddushin is puzzled to her, is not allowed to marry her, does that puzzle her from eating her father's truma? So forget about the 1 year issue. That was only relevant to a bas Yisrael. Okay, so now the question is, do we say yesh chuppah la pesulos or not? Let's say a man goes over to a woman, he has not presented her with kiddushin, he's not married to her, he says, come with me, I want to take you to the chuppah. She goes with him to the chuppah, and he stands with her underneath the chuppah. Maybe he say a couple of prayers, a couple of brachas, whatever they do under there. The fact that they're standing together under the chuppah is demonstrative of the intent to be physically intimate with her, because that's the objective of a chuppah, is to demonstrate that we are living together as husband and wife. Okay? Now normally chuppah has to come after kiddushin, but let's say there was no kiddushin presented. So this is a new case, but it's very similar to the case of our Mishnah. So Rav says that just like according to Reb Meir, presenting a woman with kiddushin passes her from the kahuna, so too is taking her under the chuppah passes her for truma. Ushmuel Omar ain't chuppah lapasul. Shmuel says no. The act of chuppah does not accomplish that. Omar Shmuel umoda li abba betinokos pechus mi bashol shanam v'yom echad hol ve'ein labia ein la chuppah. Shmuel then says, Rav will for sure agree to me that in a case where a man takes a girl who's less than 3 years old to the chuppah, since she's not capable of bia, because anyone under the age of 3 is not considered to be capable of performing the act of bia, halachically, so too, taking her to the chuppah is meaningless for that reason as well. So Amar Rava Af Ananami Tanina. Rava says that certainly Shmuel's assertion is borne out by the following brisa. Ba shaloshanim v'yom echad miskadeshes b'bia, that a girl who's 3 years old or older can have a legal marriage with bia, provided that her father consents, of course, right? V'im ba'aleha yavam kina'a, and if a yavam has bia with her, he's kona her, but again, she has to be at least 3 years old. V'chayavan aleha mishum eishes ish, and if a man has intimacy with her, as if she's already married, he can be put to death for that. Umitama is boa lalatame mishkav tachton ke'elyon, and if she's a nida, in other words, yes, it is possible for a girl to be precociously menstruant after the age of 3, and if a man is intimate with her in her status of nida, she renders him a certain level of tumah, which would mean that if he sleeps on a layer of different mattresses, even the bottom mattress becomes tameh, just as if a zav is wearing clothing, the highest thing that he's wearing will become tameh. In other words, it's not a high level tumah, but it's a rishon l'tumah, meaning that she does transmit tumah to the man who has relations with her. Nises lekohen ocheles betruma. If she marries a kohen, she's allowed to eat his truma, provided that she's 3 years old. Ba'aleha echad mikol apsulin pasla. And if any man that she's not allowed to marry has relations with her, he renders her a chalola, and she's not allowed to marry a kohen or eat truma. So we infer from that is bashaloshana v'yom echad hu de mifsala b'bia, and mifsala b'chuppah, and therefore only a girl who's 3 years old, where she can become puzzled through an act of bia, can also become puzzled through being placed under the chuppah, because the whole idea of chuppah is that it prepares her. It's a demonstration of that there's going to be an imminent consummation, right? But hapechusami b'shaloshana v'yom echad lo mifsala b'bia lo mifsala nami b'chuppah, and shmamina. But you see that if a girl is not capable of halachically performing an act of bia, and therefore she won't become puzzled if a man beds her at less than the age of 3, so too the bringing her under a chuppah at less than the age of 3 will also not passel her, even according to Rav. So that's conclusive proof, says the Gemara. Now, Amar Rami Bar Chama, yesh chuppah lepesulos banu lemachlokas Rabbi Meir v'Rabbi Elazar v'Rab Shimon. So Rami Bar Chama wants to go out on a limb, and he says this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel as to whether, if a woman is brought under the chuppah without kiddushin, whether that makes her puzzle for the kahuna and for truma, is the very same machlokas in our Mishnah. Therefore, Rav, who says that she's puzzle, holds like Reb Meir, and Shmuel, who says that she's not puzzle, goes according to Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, according to Reb Meir, who says that presenting her with kiddushin will make her puzzle, so too bringing her under the chuppah will make her puzzle, even though there's been no intimacy. And the Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, darmi kiddushin lo pasli, chuppah nami lo pasla. And according to Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, who say that kiddushin does not puzzle her, so too the chuppah will not puzzle her. Immediately the Gemara jumps in and says, umimai. Maybe your analogy is not a good analogy. Dilma ad kalo kama Reb Meir hasam ela pikidushim de kanila, aval chuppah de lo kanila lo. Maybe not. Maybe Reb Meir is only machmir to say that you've tainted her by presenting her with kiddushin is because she's legally your wife. But when you bring a woman to chuppah and you haven't presented her with anything, she's not legally your wife at that moment. So maybe you haven't tainted her according to Reb Meir. And inami, I'll go to the other side. Akan lo kami Reb Elazar Reb Shimon Hasam ela b'kiddushin de lo krivi lebia. Aval chuppah de kriva lebia hachanami de pasla. Maybe I'll tell you the other way. Maybe Reb Elazar and Reb Shimon, who say that presenting her with kiddushin does not taint her, is only because the kiddushin is completely disassociated with physical intimacy. But chuppah, the whole purpose of chuppah is to demonstrate that we are about to go to the bedroom. And if that's the case, then maybe Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon, who are lenient by kiddushin, would be machmir when you bring her to the chuppah, that you're doing a demonstrative act of imminent intimacy, that maybe they would agree to that situation, that you do taint her for truma in that case. So Ella, rather the Gemara says, rather you're right. We cannot analogize this machlokus between Rav and Shmuel to the machlokus in our Mishnah, but we're going to analogize it to another machlokus Tanoim, which we will see in Mirza Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.